Thank you very much for being here today. I'm really excited. I haven't taught this course, I think since 2018. I'm gonna go back all the way to the beginning. So archaeology in the United States can be a little bit different than archaeology in other places. Archaeology is one of the 4 fields of anthropology. And most, although not all, archaeologists who practice in America, in North America, and often in Canada, Mexico as well, really identify themselves as anthropologists. So like my degrees are all in anthropology. None of them are technically in archaeology, even though that's my specialty. Our anthropologists are really interested in questions of how people live, how we experience the world around us, what that does to us, how we develop language, what that does to our bones, what that does to our family structures. And for archaeologists, what that means is trying to understand all those same questions, but about people in the past. And we really base this on the material culture that people have left behind. So archaeology is a method, it's a set of questions for getting information about past people. It's scientific, it's theoretically driven, but it's also really intimately related to the humanities, right? So social sciences really occupy a unique place in our intellectual life. And so we have feet in multiple areas of both really objective, rigorous methodologies and more kind of intellectual, sophisticated, more subjective questions, theories, interpretations. Historical archaeology is a subfield of archaeology. There's lots and lots and lots of different types of archaeologies, even in the United States. Most people, especially in the West, are incredibly familiar, obviously, with pre-contact, or what we sometimes are used to call prehistoric archaeology. That's a term that we are slowly getting away from because it has different connotations for different groups of people here in the US. But historical archaeology can really be best explained by the era of European expansion, right? It's this last 500 years of history when Europe really started expanding out and more global connections are being made just everywhere. It is contemporaneous with archival records, but that doesn't mean that historical archaeology only explains archival records. And we can talk about that a little bit. It's also really interdisciplinary. So as is prehistoric and pre-contact archaeology, historical archaeology really relies on multiple types of data sets to approach truths about the past as closely as possible. One of the things that can be unique, but isn't all that different from pre-contact archaeology, is that the activity of historical archaeology really involves contemporary people. So not only descendant communities, but sometimes people are so close to a site that they lived there or that they experienced it with grandparents or great-grandparents or other folks who are now in the historical past, but who are part of that really contemporary memory. And I personally believe it's one of the things that has really driven archaeology in the last 30 years to be more inclusive with descendant communities and descendant voices. I think this little quote from the Society for Historical Archaeology really sums up well how most people approach historical archaeology. And that's the study of material remains of past societies that also left behind documentary and oral histories. The subfield of archaeology studies the emergence, transformation, and the nature of the modern world. And so it's an archaeology that we can really look to help explain things that are going on today. I think a really good example of that is climate change. So we have some archaeologists who are really looking at not only how we as species respond to climate change, but it's historical archaeology that is interested in the industrial period that has caused climate change. And so we've got this broader holistic view of what human activity has done to get us where we are today. and to hopefully help us find answers to get out of it. I'm going to go back to the archival records thing for a moment. So one of the reasons that I say that it's contemporaneous with archival records, but historical archaeology shouldn't just explain archival records, is because honestly, that's boring and kind of a waste of our resources, right? So if we're looking at historical records and it says Joe Smith lived here and he built a cabin and had 2 cows, and I'm like, yep, the archaeology says Joe Smith lived here and he built a cabin and had 2 cows, we've added nothing to our understanding of the past. And so historical archaeology is really at its best when we are using archaeology in companionship or in critique of archival records to give us broader understandings or more complex and nuanced understandings of the past. Historical archaeology also allows us to give voice to people who may have lived during a time of archival records, but either did not or would not write down their own stories. And that's everybody from enslaved Africans and African Americans to, impoverished farmers who were out on the Colorado plains and just didn't have time to keep a diary. Doesn't mean that we know as much about their lives as we should. So historical archaeology is really at its best when we're asking new questions that other data sets aren't telling us. So a history of historical archaeology. It's always important to understand where we came from. And I'm gonna start with Jamestown, which is also where Anglo-Euro-America started. So Jamestown, as most of you I'm sure probably know, established in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement. It kind of holds a storied and somewhat glorified position in American history. We could have a whole 5-hour course just on that. But where it's important to us today is in the 1930s, J.C. Pinckney Harrington was an architect who took a trip to New Mexico and became incredibly interested in archaeology. So he switched careers, he got an MA in archaeology. And because he had both of those backgrounds, he had this architecture background along with this archaeological background, the National Park Service invited him to run Jamestown and to start investigating it. So this is really some of our first historical archaeological investigations in the United States. I put the Harringtons because his wife Virginia was a very active partner, not only in the excavations, but in other activities with the Park Service. And everything they did, they often did together. That's not an uncommon story in archaeology. And so when we can and when we know, I do try to acknowledge the hidden people who did a lot of the work, who don't always get the credit in things. So the Harringtons started excavating Jamestown. They also set up things like the Eastern Monuments Department within the National Park Service, and they really established kind of the foundation for how the National Park Service was going to approach historical sites in the United States up through today. So this includes places like Bent's Fort out on the Eastern Plains, for any of you folks who have been there, and other historical archaeological sites. A little bit different than how places like Mesa Verde evolved within the Park Service. Historical archaeology was still not necessarily a subdiscipline throughout this period of time. So you had individuals like Pinckney Harrington in Virginia doing this work. But it wasn't until the 70s that you see kind of this fluorescence of people really taking a look at historical sites and developing questions and methodologies and theories that are particular to historical archaeology. But we see that with folks like Ivor Noel Hume and James Dietz. Hume started working at Martin's Hundred in Carter's Grove. He was actually an English archaeologist. He was an English museum person who came over to the United States to do archaeology. He really helped develop a lot of our knowledge and our chronologies of colonial ceramics. So he's still kind of the foundational person for colonial ceramics. Not something we see a lot of in Colorado. Obviously, we get ceramics much later, and we'll talk about that during the ceramics lecture today. But I do think it's important to know about colonial ceramics, to know about historical artifacts that might be more common on the East Coast or on the California coast than they are here. You folks are pretty dynamic, and I would expect that even if you're not volunteering or working in other parts of the country, that you would visit, that you have other interests. And so I think it is important to bring some of that information in. Jim Dietz started working at Plymouth. Dietz was really similar to the Harringtons. Plymouth was not necessarily a research question that he sought out. He was participating in some other activities, and the Plymouth folks thought he was fantastic and asked him to do some more work. His book, In Small Things Forgotten, is still one of the primary texts that are given to both undergraduates and graduate students. He really focused on and discussed talking about the experience of everyday people. So Jamestown and Martin's Hundred, in some ways, especially today, they eventually got to everyday people. At Carter's Grove and Martin's Hundred, there was a Native American attack and uprising against settlers, and so that was very much a focus of what Hume was looking at, as well as the wealthy plantation owners. And the Harringtons really started looking at Jamestown through the lens of the leaders who were there. So it's Dietz who starts really discussing kind of everyday experiences and lives. And he does this through different types of artifacts. I think his most famous artifact type that he discusses is northeastern gravestones. So he really looks at the seriation, he looks at the symbology, he looks at the metaphors that are literally carved into stone and what they tell us about American belief systems. Also in the late 1970s, we have Stan South, and he's one of the first archaeologists who starts looking at non-Anglo sites. So he is active at a place called Charlestown Landing in Charleston, South Carolina. And in 1566, it was the location of a Spanish settlement, one of the earliest Spanish settlements that came that far north into North America. So after these gentlemen, we get kind of the next generation, and it was mostly gentlemen, we get the next generation of folks who really have set the tone for historical archaeology. We have Kathleen Deegan, who was contemporaneous with South and Dietz, not so much Hume. Hume worked for a long time, but he was part of an older generation. But she really starts looking at historical archaeological sites in a much more contemporary way, a way that we recognize a little bit more today. So she was really active at St. Augustine in Florida and Fort Mose. Fort Mose was a really important site. It was a free black settlement, but it was used as this political buffer between the Spanish and the English. And so she's really looking at this interplay of cultures and peoples that are at this site. Wow, there's just upheaval and change in what is today the southeastern United States. These next four people are really dear to my heart. I've had the opportunity to study with all of them. Teresa Singleton was the first African-American historical archaeologist, and she was also one of my professors at Syracuse. She started her career looking at the Gullah Geechee of coastal Georgia. Both in South Carolina and Georgia, there were these African-American communities that had really survived with some very unique cultural characteristics and features off of the coast of both of these states since pre-emancipation. These are cultures that still exist today. They're under a lot of pressure. They live on islands that are hot for development. Things like farming and other traditional activities are harder and harder for a lot of people in the United States. So she was one of the first folks to start looking at communities like that. But also, she has modeled continuing those relationships with those communities and talking about contemporary issues that stem from these kind of historical conditions. Leland Ferguson was an undergrad professor of mine. He was one of the first folks to look at colonial wear. If you go to the Southeast, colonial wear is hot. Everybody has an opinion about it and talks about it. Leland was one of the first people. Colonial ware is a locally handmade ceramic that pre-Civil War is almost exclusively associated with enslaved Africans and African Americans. What Leland identified were aspects of these pots that were actually cultural holdovers and carryovers from African cultures. And so he has a fantastic book where he puts forth this hypothesis and this theory, and he talks about how even in enslavement, African Americans were able to retain different cultural practices. It hasn't always held up to other researchers' scrutiny, but I think it's really important that he was one of the first people to start asking these questions and to start looking for this kind of evidence and really kind of pushing these ideas in this theory. Christopher DeCourse is also at Syracuse as was Doug Armstrong. He recently retired. But Chris was one of the first folks to do really rigorous historical archaeological investigations in Africa. So his specialty is Elmina Castle in Ghana. And Elmina Castle was the last place on the African coast where enslaved people were brought before they were taken onto ships and taken across the Atlantic to the Americas. And so he's done extensive research there, as well as in Sierra Leone. And again, in keeping with this commitment to community, Chris is also really active in bringing a lot of African students to Syracuse so that they can study in the United States, get their PhD. And many of them, take that home, and we've got this just amazing and beautiful cross-cultural, international, intellectual body of people who are looking at archaeology from a truly global perspective. And then Douglas Armstrong, who is my advisor, started work in the Caribbean when most Caribbean archaeology was really focused on, again, pre-contact or even the contact period. He looked at Drax Hall and other plantations, again with a focus on enslaved individuals, to really try to get into what those experiences and that life was like. Because we have plenty of data sets and approaches and ways to understand the plantation owners or the other folks in those places. Today, there are many, many historical archaeological programs. Most of them are back east in the Midwest or in California. We do have people who study historical archaeology here in Colorado, and we'll talk about some of them in a moment. But it's really become a very global subdiscipline. And there's a couple of different journals that are dedicated just to historical archaeology. So we have a lot of really interesting, complex, and unique sites here in Colorado. So again, historical archaeology in Colorado is going to have started a little bit later. Historical archaeology in Colorado is going to date back to when the Spanish first had incursions into different parts of the state, and then when we finally had other Euro-Americans and African Americans non-native folks who were coming to this area for various reasons. Some of the more famous and well-known sites, we have Camp Amache, also called Camp Granada because it's in Granada, Colorado. We have an exhibit upstairs if anybody wants to take a break during lunch or some other time to walk it, you are welcome to. Dr. Bonnie Clark has been doing work there for over 20 years. And she's really been able to work with the descendant community of survivors of the Japanese internment camp and look at what their everyday life was like. One of the most interesting things that has come out of that I think has really kind of grabbed the public imagination is this Amache rose. So Dr. Clark identified that life in the camp in some ways was really, really typical, right? And people who were interned there, the internees, were really trying to keep some aspects of their life as normal as possible. They had gardens, they had school, there were Boy Scouts, there were all sorts of activities. They have identified and have recultivated this rose that apparently was common during the Japanese internment period in these camps. It's called the Amache rose. The Botanic Gardens have started growing it, and they've got a nice video online. I've got the link down here, and you guys will have access to all of these materials this weekend, and all these links and resources. So I think it's really captured people's imaginations that in this really oppressive, horrible place, that Japanese Americans were still trying to find a life for themselves that had peace and beauty in it. And this rose is kind of a symbol of that. And that's something that we see across a lot of different sites, right? Like at the end of the day, humans are humans. And regardless of what's going on in the world, they're trying to live their everyday lives. And what does that look like and what does that mean? It's also important to remind us that natural items can be cultural items. So, we have to think about that as we approach either a field site or lab work, and we're trying to identify what may or may not be important for us to tell a story about these people from the past. Another site that's near and dear to my heart, the picture in your top right is Deerfield. Deerfield was an African-American farming community out in Weld County on the Eastern Plains. It mostly dried up in the 30s. This particular picture is of a market that is just off of Highway 34. However, the town site is small, but the site of Deerfield in general is actually pretty extensive because there were large farms out there. And we've started working with a family who, their 5th generation, their family was one of the first settlers of Deerfield, and they've held on to the property, to the stories, and to a lot of material culture about that history. And so we're helping to work with them to nominate their property to the National Register and to tell their family's story much more fully. We also get other types of sites. So in the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of Ludlow and the Ludlow Massacre. Before I came to Colorado, this was the only historical site I knew of in this state. But again, it's a really important site, and archaeology here has really helped tell the story of the Union members and the folks who fought and died here, because the narrative of what happened there was really written by the state, right, and by the people who massacred the workers who lived there. So I think it's a really great example of that's what historical archaeology is at its best, when we're helping to tell those more full stories. So let's take a moment and talk about historic sites. How many of you guys have been out, how many of you guys have done any field work, historical or otherwise? A good many. Okay, good. Hopefully this is a little bit of a review for you. So historic sites can be really complicated. They're multi-component. Sometimes in similar ways as pre-contact sites, we get different eras of occupation overlaying each other. Humans are humans. We all like to live in the same area, and so we kind of go where that other guy lived before because he chose a really good spot. They're also multi-component in the fact that they don't just have on-surface or subsurface archaeological assemblages, but there's other features that we have to take into account. This can be standing buildings, things like houses, chicken coops, barns, different mining buildings, which again, we could spend an entire weekend on, but we won't. It can also be things like landscape. So if you are within, going back to plantations, those have designed landscapes, right? Somebody sat down, someone like Thomas Jefferson or somebody else, sat down and they planned out what their built environment was gonna look like. So not only where the houses were gonna be and where the outbuildings were gonna be, but paths and gardens and trees. And so again, going back to the Amache Rose, those sorts of features that can feel like they're just natural, like that tree's always been there, that might be historically important because somebody may have planted it there purposely. So landscape design is something that we should think about when we're in the field and we're looking at a site. This is also part of larger cultural, social, and natural landscapes, again, like pre-contact sites. So people put dwellings, they put mining sites, they put other types of historical sites in certain places for certain reasons. And it's always related to what's around it. What's around it or what's near it can change, right? So the distances or the geographic relationships are going to be really unique to each different site. One of the things that I think is unique about historical archaeology is that we can sometimes be a little bit more explicit about our theoretical approach. So, again, we don't just want to go out on a site and say, yeah, Jim Smith lived here and he built a barn and he had a couple cows. We want to say something much more interesting. We want to have a better idea of why did he have 2 cows? Why did he put his barn there? Why was Joe Smith even here? Like, what is he doing in this place? And in order to ask those questions, we have to think about how we're approaching our data and how we're going to ask questions of our data, and that's theory. It's really just kind of the intellectual framework that archaeologists are using to think about their sites. And kind of basic theory, just to give you guys, again, the really kind of down and dirty history. Processual archaeology, also called the New Archaeology, was the dominant mode of archaeology, whether it was historical or prehistorical, in the late 20th century. So this is folks like Binford, right? There's an emphasis on objectivity, on statistics, quantitative analysis, and the entire purpose was to try to approach these laws of human behavior, right? Like what can we say about this site that tells us how all humans across the world are going to like think and react? We didn't quite get there. After a couple of decades of new archaeology, these laws of human behavior never quite materialized, at least not in a way that was interesting or unique, right? There are some basic laws. We all need food and water. We all build shelters of various types. But then the way that we do those things and approach those things within our individual cultures is so massively different that new archaeology alone couldn't really answer those questions. So you get into the 80s and 90s, and you get post-processual archaeology. This starts to get messy. And so what people are doing in post-processual archaeology is they're starting to add other theoretical aspects to things. So Joe Smith came out and he built his barn and he had his 2 cows. You know, what was his agency? You know, how much of this is he working off of as an individual and just doing weird stuff, because we all do weird stuff as individuals? How much of this is he pulling from a broader cultural framework because perhaps he is a new German-Russian immigrant, and so he's got certain mindsets about how these things are done. Or maybe Joe Smith was African-American, and this is post-emancipation. And so again, we can start asking these different questions that allow us to have kind of more rich interpretations of the past. So this is really important and comes into play with artifacts, right? Because artifacts are our data set, and ultimately at the end of the day, that's the primary thing we are asking these questions about. So artifacts can play a lot of different roles within a culture. Artifacts carry a lot of symbolism and a lot of weight. I think I did not accidentally choose these two things. I think both of these hats, although one is not quite right because I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. Both of these hats symbolize a lot of ideological and material realities in the United States right now. That's no different than artifacts in the past, right? And how people choose to use artifacts within their family, within their community, and within broader society is really what we're trying to get to. They can be used to understand social and political changes. They can be signifiers of gender, of age, of sex, of all different sorts of things. But oftentimes we can only get to those through our theoretical lens. And we can use the same sets of artifacts with different theoretical lenses to ask different questions. And that's one of the reasons that we hold on to artifacts and we curate them in perpetuity, because my theoretical lens might be really different than your theoretical lens, and that drives our research questions as archaeologists. Historical archaeology can look really simple, literally on the surface, but we have to be really careful. We see a lot of differences in historic sites, often than pre-contact sites, for things like curating our artifacts, right? And I think probably every single one of us in this room has artifacts that predate us or our houses. My house was built in 1951. I was born in 1978. If I died and my house burned down, and 1,000 years from now somebody is digging that, they're gonna find artifacts from the 1800s. They might find artifacts from further way ago than that, right? Like, maybe I took my work home with me that weekend. Maybe there's a mano metate sitting in the basement for analysis. So we have to really think about the context. Stratigraphy is as important in historical sites as it is in pre-contact sites. Sometimes our stratigraphy isn't as visible or as defined as in pre-contact sites. We can have really thin eras of occupation and thin eras of deposition that we are looking at. So being rigorous in the field can be really important. We can have so much stuff in a historic site too that it is overwhelming. One of the sites that we're gonna use as kind of our case study for the rest of the weekend, the Ferris Hotel site, is one of those sites. I also think about a couple years ago, some of you may have seen in the newspaper, General Palmer's middens, his trash pits down in Colorado Springs were excavated. There were hundreds of thousands of artifacts in those middens, and they just dated to the 15 or 20 years that Palmer and his family lived at that site. That's really different from the sites. I was out east of Trinidad this summer. Some of you may have been. We had a joint PAAC PCRG project, and we were on some sites that were Hispano-American sites. A lot less material culture. They didn't have the money the Palmers had. It was hard to get stuff out there. And so the context changes even if contemporaneously they're from the same era. So we always have to keep context in mind. All right, I promise you we're getting into the fun stuff. Okay, identifying artifacts. So artifacts by themselves are largely meaningless. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is, how is it made? Even when we're dealing with historical and we're really looking at manufactured and mass-produced items, it's important to understand how things are made, because that gives us the baseline information that we need about artifacts. How old is it? Where is it from? That allows us to maybe think about who bought it, who used it, what did they use it for? And then we're getting into the more complicated questions, because it may have been used for something that it was not made for, right? A term you all may have heard of, or you may be familiar with from pre-contact archaeology is chaîne à potoir. This is typically a term that is used with lithic manufacture, especially in Europe. We're talking about like how were projectile points or other lithic artifacts manufactured. But that same concept can really be applied and should be applied to all artifacts to get down to that kind of basic foundational information. And then finally, going back to my original point, what is the relationship of the cool artifact you found to all the other artifacts around it? When we are discussing lithic manufacture, but it's a really good concept to always, what was the manufacturing process of that porcelain plate or of that nail that you found on site? Another really good question to ask is this cultural? Often with manufactured artifacts, that's an obvious answer. Yes, it's going to be. It's less obvious sometimes when we're talking about prehistoric artifacts. People can see patterns that don't exist. It's important to talk about when we're talking about things like natural artifacts. So the seed from that amache rose. On first blush, it doesn't necessarily look cultural, but it was very much a cultural artifact. Does this have analytical value? That may or may not be in the eyes of the beholder, and as we get into different artifact types, we can discuss that. As much as we have any sort of raging debates in Colorado historical archaeology, there's raging debates around the analytical value of tin cans. I fall on the side that yes, they have tons of analytical value. A lot of my colleagues would prefer to walk over them and never take a second look. And then finally, if all of these questions are answered, does this tell me part of the story? How does this inform my research question, or how does this inform our understanding of the site? And again, oftentimes that'll probably come back to your questions and your theoretical lens. And different ones of us are going to have different answers to all of these questions. I would like to go over real quick how we would record artifacts in the lab. And some of you are volunteers who come into Emory, and if you're not, when we're recording artifacts, what we're really trying to do is identify the most baseline information so that future researchers, future students, people who are interested in that site or that period can come back and ask their own questions about it. So we have to be careful not to walk that line into interpretation. And it's fun going through some of our artifacts from Ferris, as well as even our comparative collection that I'm going to share with you this weekend. You can see where people kind of stepped over that line into interpretation. And sometimes it's wrong, right? So it's okay to disagree with whoever came before you and was writing on those tags. It's okay to have different ideas and different identifications. Typically, we start with the broadest possible category. Is it ceramic? Is it glass? Is it metal? Is it lithic? We do get historic lithics in lots of different forms. We identify features and characteristics, colors, shapes, sizes, body types. So if it's a bottle or if it's a ceramic vessel and it's broken, is it a body shard? Is it a shoulder? So we identify that kind of information. Again, we're still not making interpretation. We shouldn't guess or speculate, and we should only record direct observations. So that might mean you have really limited information about an individual artifact, and that's okay. Just because there's columns to fill out doesn't mean you should feel compelled to fill out all the columns. A void function is that's getting into interpretation and analysis. If you're asking your own questions, if you have specific ideas about a site and maybe you're writing something up for Southwestern Lore, or you're working with somebody, absolutely, then we get into interpretation. But when we're working in the lab, we really need to focus on that ground level information so that future people can identify if this is a collection that they will find useful and want to work with. I also want to say a little something about research and resources. So just like my friend Abe Lincoln says up here, please don't believe everything you read on the internet. We've been finding that a lot of folks immediately go to some internet resources. And even well-known internet resources are not necessarily right, or they might not be the identification and interpretation that like Sarah and I agree with, right? So we can have lots of disagreements even within the discipline about what something is, what its importance is, its diagnostic value. There are some websites that are really, really, really good. So the SHA bottle site is pretty universal. It's an SHA BLM site. And again, I will share all of these. We'll email all of this stuff out to you guys. So you'll have all of these links. And it's also updated. So it's not a static site, which is really nice. The Florida Museum Digital Ceramic Type Collection is absolutely brilliant. It's been around for like at least 20, 25 years, and no one has even come close. And it has these amazing pictures of historic ceramics from all different eras, very Southeast focused, but it's still very useful for us out here. And it gives really good descriptions so that if you're struggling with trying to identify what a ceramic sherd might be, this will help. We're also really big on peer-reviewed sources in trusted institutions and organizations. Obviously, peer-reviewed sources can be more difficult for people not in academic settings to get access to, and that includes us. We don't always have access to everything that like CU Boulder or CSU does. But we do keep peer-reviewed resources. We can get access to them. And so as things come up in different labs and in different projects, you know, we highly recommend those. I have a pretty extensive library of stuff. And in Colorado, we have really good relationships, even for this class and for some other things we're doing in the lab. I asked colleagues, hey, what are the resources you guys are using? I'm trying to update my materials. I want to update some of our lab resources. And so people share. So don't be afraid to ask, whether it's History Colorado, whether it's other archaeologists you know. We're always happy to get you guys those reference materials that you might need. Because we're working with historical sites, there's other resources that we often use that sometimes other people don't think about. So we want to know, was Joe Smith the first guy who lived there, or did he maybe take that property over from somebody else? And there's a lot of really good resources for that. The Bureau of Land Management has their GLO records. They are the ones who are responsible for all of the record keeping for things like the 1862 Land Act. Assessors' offices, treasurers, clerks' offices, there's a lot of publicly available information about both contemporary and historic land ownership use and other things. Warranty and mining deeds are a really good resource if you're looking at mining sites, as well as the Colorado Division of Water Resources, because they talk about water rights, and water rights are obviously tied to land ownership and land use and first in place sorts of ideas. So again, those are some places that you can look. John Horn from Alpine Archaeology, who I stole a lot of this information from, he has some really good guidance documents on all of these different types of research resources that I think he would probably be very happy to share. He shared it with me. So that is our down and dirty historical archaeology lecture.